I, in my spare time, run an outreach initiative for kids around the world called Kids Care About Climate Change. And I originally, in 2021, asked them to draw what they love most about trees as a way to help cool the earth, to help penguins, corals, and people. And I got a lot of entries from 33 countries, 2,629, and we made a giant 7-meter long by 4-meter wide banner, which I've been taking all around the world.
This production was recorded at the podcast studios in the Media Arts Centre at Murdoch University. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Murdoch University. Any content provided by the hosts and guests are their personal opinions and are not intended to represent the views or opinions of the university, its administration, faculty, or staff. Now we have that out of the way, let's talk science. Paramount Importance.
And you might be surprised to hear that it's really hard to get media attention for this giant banner and the kids' right to a safe planet to live on. I've been videoing it with the drone and getting kids to record personal messages and making videos that have been shown at 4 different United Nations climate meetings, but I still don't feel like it gets enough attention. So I decided to try to definitely break the Guinness World Record for the longest continuous hugging of a tree. So the current world record is 24 hours, 20 minutes, and 4 seconds or something like that from a gentleman in Africa. And I heard about that incidentally, but that didn't even make the news. And I thought, that's so wrong. That person hugged that tree that whole time, which had to be tedious, and no one knows about it. And the reason he did it was to raise an awareness, but there's no awareness that he even did it. And I've run these huge contests, and I have contacts all over the world. I could hug the tree and do it on behalf of the 2,629 kids who did drawings and the 8,400 and some kids who've now played with the giant banner. And then I thought, how can I get people excited about this and get them to know I'm doing it? And I realized that I could let kids and adults around the world determine how long I hug the tree for. So in a month or so, I'm going to open up my website asking people to send in either a photograph or a drawing of them hugging a tree. And for each one I receive, that will add 1 minute to my tree hugging marathon.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, that's amazing. So what's the website? Because I want straight away people want to be...
Yeah, it's https kidscareaboutclimate.org.
Okay, awesome. Everyone that's heard that, donate, send a picture in. That's amazing.
It's not ready for you to send in yet, but keep checking. It won't be too long.
When this goes out, it will be.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so just to give you a context, for me to break the record, I need about 1,500 photos.
Okay.
And I'm willing to go for up to a week, which is 10,080. So, yeah. And each person...
So if you're going to be hugging it for a week, does that mean you can't let your arms off the tree?
Right. So there's a lot of logistics involved. So this is why this was so useful to figure out as a mechanism to know how long to hug it for. Because one of my colleagues, Michael, your friend...
Yeah.
He said, you shouldn't say how long you're going to hug it for. You should just see how long you can go. But that's like a logistical nightmare because I need someone to be with me every minute. But I liked his thought, which was you want to build excitement in the people. And I kept thinking, how else could I build engagement and excitement and make people feel like they were part of it? And that's when I had the idea to let them determine how long I had to do it for. But yeah, I'm going to have a roster of people someone has to be with me every minute to like prove I was doing it, video it, but also to like give me water and food. And
yeah, that's incredible.
It's
my first
a
two
bit
questions
crazy.
is, yeah, it is. It is. My first question is like, how are you going to sleep?
I don't think I'm going to really do much sleep.
But
So
yeah, you need to sleep for a week.
well, who knows if it'll end up being a week, but yeah.
That's incredible.
I mean, I think though, like,
could you rig up like a sling? That
yes,
you can sort of,
yes. So my husband's like an engineering type. He was in the Air Force for many years, and I've already asked him to, what could he imagine he could put on the tree so that I could rest my arms on it. I've got to make sure that's loud, of course.
Yeah.
But something like that will be useful. And then I got to pick the tree carefully. I want to be able to hug it and still stand up, sit down, change position, stuff like that. But I think the fact that it will be physically demanding for me to do, and people will think, oh, I don't know if I could do that, that's an essential ingredient to build the momentum and bring the issue into people's minds. Like, I don't really care about having a world record myself, but
it's the raising of awareness.
It's because whenever I mention it, no one is impassive when I say this.
No, it's blown me away straight away. What a great start to this podcast. Did you say it's only kids can send pictures?
No, anyone.
Anyone. All right. Everyone send in a picture to the website we just mentioned and let's go.
And don't worry if you don't want to show your face, because you can hug the tree where the tree is there and the camera is taking a picture of the tree and your hands and not your face.
Okay.
So it's okay if you don't want your face to show. That's totally fine.
Awesome. All right, everyone, jump on it. Well, what a great start to the podcast. And I also am super glad that we actually postponed the first time we booked this podcast, and we've done it after I went sailing because I learned so much about wind. And our topic today is on cyclones.
Yep.
And so it was a great experience to go sailing around for 5-6 weeks.
Super jealous.
Yeah, it was. It was incredible. But yeah, I got to learn so many different things about wind and how important it is for obviously sailing, and then also with cyclones. So then to have a bit more knowledge in this area to be able to speak to you today was probably really good timing for that. So.
Awesome.
My first question is what is a spatial ecological data scientist in your own words?
Yeah, so that's my job title, and it was really interesting because when I got that written on my door, that was the first time I really was like, I'm really a scientist because it's in my job title. Imposter syndrome. But so if you break it down, spatial ecological data scientist. Ecology is looking at the relationships between different living organisms and their environment. And spatial refers to where things are, why they're there, how they change, and why they change. And so, and then data science refers to like the theories and techniques we can use to crunch data to try and discover things we need to learn. So essentially, I'm a geographer with ecological knowledge and interested in ecological systems. And I'm trying to bring that spatial toolkit to the ecology world, because what sometimes people forget is that everything is somewhere. And usually it actually matters why it's there and not in a different place. And if it's changed in where it is over time, that can be really important too. So it's about bringing that whole new way of thinking from geography and techniques from geospatial, spatial science into the practice of ecology, but in a modern way, using all these great data science techniques that we have.
That sounds very complex. Like there's multiple disciplines that you're converging.
It's very multidisciplinary. So when I did my undergraduate studies, I did a liberal arts degree. So I did a I had a major in geography and environmental science, but we had to do religion, fine arts, foreign language, philosophy, a little bit of everything. And I find that super valuable. We were talking before we started the podcast about how it used to be a long time ago that everything was just critical thinking, and arts contributed and science contributed, and it all came in together. And I think today things get a little bit siloed. But I come from this more cross-disciplinary background, and that's what geography does. It enables other disciplines with its own toolkit. So,
Right. Interesting. So how does like cyclones fit into this? Because this is what we're going to be talking about today.
Yes. So cyclones are a great conundrum from a spatial perspective. I usually show this awesome video of a reconstructed Cyclone Winston, which is barreling towards Fiji. And in the video, you can see that there's a clear spatial structure in what the cyclone looks like, which we can easily reconstruct with freely available data. So you might have heard that a cyclone has a calm bit in the middle called the eye, which is like roughly a circle. And then there's inward spiraling winds and rain bands. And at the boundary of that calm eye is where you have the biggest, most towering clouds, and that's where you have the highest wind speeds and the biggest waves. And so that broad scale structure is relatively easy to reconstruct using even just empirical models. So from a spatial perspective, you can map out every hour along a cyclone's track what it was doing in terms of things that matter to you, like big winds and big waves. But when you zoom in and you try and look at the response to ecological systems like coral reefs to what the cyclone is doing, then the closer you look, the more infinitely complex it becomes spatially. Because cyclone waves and any waves can get blocked by reefs. So when a wave is coming into a reef, the first bit of underwater structure it reaches can dissipate up to 97% of the wave height and 75% of the wave power. So it creates a wave shadow beyond that first thing it hits. Essentially, the easy way to say it is reefs block each other from waves. So,
right. I'm going to throw a left field question here. It's with waves, but it's not to do with cyclones.
Okay.
But recently when we were sailing, I was in the Tuamotu Islands, within the atolls, and that's when that tsunami warning that came from the earthquake in Russia. Would a tsunami, because it's like the atolls are obviously volcanic islands that have sunk, but their structures underwater is just from 1,000 meters of water to the surface. Does the tsunami sort of just move around the island, or does it actually, like, are you in trouble? Because there was a few theories being thrown around by the sailors that were there saying it's like, oh, we're actually safe on their atolls because the wave doesn't, like, the water just moves around it. It doesn't go over the top.
Okay. Well, tsunami waves are fundamentally different than wind waves.
Yeah.
If you're talking about a wind wave, definitely depending on how deep of water you're in. So if the atoll's submerged in deep enough water, then the waves might just go right over it. So that'll depend on the wavelength and everything, because there's formulas that tell you how, for a given wavelength, how deep it is that the wave starts to feel the bottom under it. So if the water's deep enough, it won't be affected what's under it. But so with wind waves, they are affected by the structure, and they would dissipate at the front and then bend around. Yes, but I'm not a tsunami expert, but I do. I do know that tsunami waves are fundamentally different because they're super, super long wavelengths and super powerful, and they become tall when they feel the bottom and they rear up. But they've got a lot more energy in them. So like they can propagate up things a lot further. So like, for example, with this tsunami warnings of this recent one, people were like, oh, it's only going to be a 5 meter or a 1 meter. That's not going to do anything. But the power in the tsunami wave means that little bit of extra water is going to keep going. It's not going to die off like a normal wave would because it has so much more power behind it. So I don't know the actual answer to your question, but it's something to look into.
No one knew the answer when we were out there. Yeah, so I just sort of split it in the back of my mind. It sort of just came out.
Every wave isn't the same, like Japan. Especially not tsunami waves. Yeah.
I'll get back to cyclones.
Okay.
What is a cyclone and how is it different from a hurricane and a tornado?
Yeah, so that's a great question because the answer is all rooted in geography again, which is my favorite topic. So first of all, be aware that cyclones, hurricanes, and typhoons are all exactly the same thing. The only reason they have a different name is because in different locations on the globe, people chose to give them a different name. Tropical cyclones, kind of a generic term for the phenomenon, but in North America and the North Atlantic, they call them hurricanes and they rank them slightly differently. And then in the Northwest Pacific, they're called typhoons. And everywhere else, they're just called tropical cyclones. And they all have slightly different ranking schemes of how they decide, like, how strong they are. So there's a whole Wikipedia page which lays it out really nicely. But people often get baffled by that.
Just to make it a bit more confusing.
Yeah. So to get back to basics of what it actually is and how that relates to a tornado. So maybe it's easiest to start with a tornado. So with a tornado, you've got a quickly spiraling, very fast spiraling structure, very ephemeral on both spatial and temporal scales. So what happens is you have a thunderstorm. In a thunderstorm, you get a cold air mass colliding with a warm air mass over a very small distance. And that creates turbulence and that in the atmosphere, which can lead, doesn't have to lead, to the spiraling structure because it creates a low pressure area and a high pressure area just outside, which causes that to happen. But a tornado, they spawn out of thunderstorms and they might only last like 10 minutes. Like they're super hard to predict. What people predict with them is there could be one. And that gives you a warning. And then if one is sighted, that gives you a watch. And if someone sees one touching down, then you get a warning. So you can imagine that 99% of the time when there's a tornado watch, there's no freaking tornado. So nobody goes and shelters because usually there isn't one. But it's the case where if there is and you don't go into a safe like room with no external walls, like you might be like the cow and Twister flying through the air. So anyway, but they're very compact. So you could have a tornado completely demolish a house so that there's nothing but debris left, and the next door neighbor house could be completely untouched. So they're very fine scaled spatially and temporally. But cyclones are much broader in time and space scales. So a cyclone actually, in its thunderstorms and within its wind field, it can even spawn tornadoes.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So, by the way, also...
hands of destruction.
Yeah.
Or fingers of destruction, probably.
Yeah, like one of my colleagues, Ben Radford, was in Hurricane Andrew in Florida, and tornadoes were spawned during that. And so it makes it tricky when you're predicting the wind fields of the hurricanes or cyclones, because you will have very isolated parts that are going to have extremely higher winds because there was a tornado. But anyway, so cyclones also are driven by a low pressure center and higher pressure in the surrounding environment. And that's what makes wind in general, right? It blows from higher pressure to lower pressure. I remember a science teacher I had in 8th grade, year 8, who said, imagine there's a room filled with balls, maybe they're marbles, and the door's closed and it's filled all the way to the top, so there's no room for anything else to fit in there. And then you open the door to the next room and it's empty. What's going to happen? The balls are going to all rush into the other room, and that's how wind works. So just in a cyclone, it's super extreme example. So it's super low pressure in the middle and high pressure on the outside of the storm system. And so the winds spiral in trying to get to the lower pressure. And so they're at vastly different scales. So I talked about a tornado impacting one house, but not the one next door. Cyclones can vary greatly in size, but the smallest one ever recorded was Cyclone Tracy, which hit Darwin in 1974. And the diameter of it was only 100 kilometers. So that's small.
It's still very big.
Yeah, but the biggest one ever recorded was Typhoon Tip in 1979 and up in the Northwest Pacific, maybe near the Philippines, I'm not sure. And it was 2,200 kilometers in size,
Wow.
like in diameter.
So to put that into relative or perspective, how big is Australia? That's like 4,000,
in some of the presentations I've given, I've drawn Cyclone Tracy and Typhoon Tip on a map of Australia. And it, like, if you drew it centered on the Great Barrier Reef, like, it would contain the whole thing. Like, it's huge. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Because the Great Barrier Reef is about 1,000 kilometers along the coast if you draw a straight line, like, through it.
Yeah. So that would roughly cover most of, like, say, Western Australia. Actually, pretty much would cover all of Western Australia.
Yeah.
Easy.
Yeah. So luckily, most cyclones aren't that huge. But one of the common misconceptions people have is they think a big cyclone means a strong cyclone, and they're two separate qualities. So the size tells you how much area of land or ocean the circulation of the cyclone covers. Whether that cyclone is weak or strong, it doesn't matter. It could be either. So you can get big cyclones that are weak, like on the Great Barrier Reef. We had Cyclone Justin in 1997, which affected 2/3 of the Great Barrier Reef. It was big, but it was relatively weak. So it did cause some severe damage, but didn't like have the devastation it would if it was stronger. But here in Western Australia, we had Cyclone Lua in, I think it was it 2013? Which was really big and strong, but luckily not super slow moving. But we actually recorded severe damage at Scott Reef and some shoals. Scott Reef was, I think, 600 kilometers away from the track of the cyclone, and the shoals were almost 900 kilometers away. So that gives you a sense of how different it can be in terms of the actual wind and wave spatial structure if you have a big versus a small.
How do cyclones form?
Yeah, so a lot of people focus on the fact that they need warm sea surface temperatures to form, which is one of the 6 factors that they need. It needs to be at least 26.5 degrees Celsius, and that needs to be sustained at the surface, and that needs to extend down, I think, about 50 meters depth. And
that's really warm. So, like, I know in perspective of Perth, or the Perth listeners, that's like our water's around 20 to 17.
Yeah.
Really.
So that's why, putting on the geography hat again, I think one of your questions might be later, where do they tend to form? They form in tropical waters because that's where you find those kind of sea surface temperatures. So usually within about 20 degrees north or south of the equator. but where they form is different to where they track. But getting back to your question, it needs to be warm enough. That warm energy, that warm temperature is like the power source of the cyclone because it also contributes to the low pressure. So you've got a really warm ocean that leads to unstable air. Rising air is lower pressure. So it kind of feeds into that. But there's actually 5 other factors that need to coincide. So you can't have a cyclone forming too close to the equator, usually not within about 8 degrees, either north or south. And so this will test everyone's geography skills. Have you heard of the Coriolis force?
I have, yes.
Yay! So we know the Earth is round. And incidentally, just so you know how crazy I am, yesterday I was the Earth for 270 primary school students. And it's relevant because I was wearing an inflatable Earth costume. So my fattest part of my costume was the equator because the Earth is not exactly, but mainly round. So when you're at the equator, you've got winds blowing consistently around the Earth because it's rotating. And as you move north or south away from the equator, those winds get deflected because the Earth is no longer that fat and it gets less and less fat as you go towards the poles. And so that creates a deflection of the winds. And so if you're too close to the equator, you don't have that. And cyclones need that to spin up. You also need atmospheric instability. So that means rising air. You need a pre-existing disturbance like a storm has already formed. And you can't have what's called wind shear. So wind shear are vertical downward blowing winds. So if you imagine when you've been on an airplane and you've had like really bad turbulence where the plane suddenly drops, that's an example of wind shear. And in fact, airports didn't, but scientists came up with Doppler radar because it was so dangerous to try to land airplanes in wind shear conditions, because you can imagine you're trying to land and you don't want to get smashed into the ground. But anyway, wind shear does the same thing to the cyclone circulation. It wants to circulate in the horizontal plane as well as downward in the center, but it shreds the air currents as they're trying to flow in and keep the structure going of the cyclone. So you can't have too much wind shear. And if you ever nerd out and like listen to detailed weather forecasts during a cyclone, the meteorologists will talk about, oh, it's an unfavorable environment for the cyclone because it has wind shear, or there's dry air getting sucked into the circulation because it needs the moist, unstable air.
So that's why when they hit land, they tend to lose force or lose power.
Yeah, that's right. So when they hit land, they no longer have the heat coming off the ocean to power them. And then, it messes up some of the other factors as well.
Right. In different hemispheres, the northern and south, do they spin different directions?
Yeah, so that's right. So in the southern hemisphere, you have the anti-clockwise, or am I mixing it up? It's the opposite in the hemispheres, and that's because of the shape of the Earth and the way that the
Coriolis effect.
Yeah, the Coriolis effect. Yeah. So on that, if you ever watched The Simpsons, they actually had an episode where the Simpsons went to Australia, and the first thing Bart did was flush the toilet to see if the water went down the other way.
Which I think's a myth. The very first podcast I did was with Chari Patriarch.
Ah, yes.
And I'm pretty sure that, because that's going back 6 years or so, that I asked him that question.
Yeah, it doesn't work in the toilet, I don't think.
No, or the bathtub. It was, that part was myth.
So that was funny.
Yeah.
Hopefully people don't get their full 100% science content from The Simpsons.
No. I think there's probably a few that do. So
it's funny though.
I want to talk about, like, are they more common in the La Nina and the El Nino? So I guess we describe what a La Nina and an El Nino.
Yeah, so the
is.
ENSO is the global weather climate phenomenon, which has to do with sea surface temperatures and air pressures on either side of the Pacific Ocean. And so it depends on where you are. So for Australia, when we have La Nina, we tend to get more cyclones tracking closer to the Queensland coast than we do in El Nino. But in other parts of the world, it'll work differently. It depends on where you are, how it plays out. So, but there's been a lot of studies where people have looked in different ocean basins and tried to link cyclone frequency with El Nino and La Nina.
Right. And there's not a direct correlation, or there is? I guess you just sort of mentioned just depending on where you are.
Yeah, it depends on where you are, how it plays out, but it tends to influence, where the storminess is and where the tracking of the cyclones tend to go. But there's other things that influence it as well, so it's complicated.
How do ocean currents influence the cyclones? Does that sort of how do cyclones track where they want to go?
Yeah, so cyclone tracking is really hard to predict, and people, when they hear I study cyclones, think I can tell you where they're going to go. And if I could do that, I would be so rich. But no, I don't even try and do that. There's a whole bunch of meteorologists who do that. But yes, ocean currents are relevant. And also like things that are happening in the atmosphere. So where you have highs and lows in the atmosphere, that also affects it. But with ocean currents, they can be warm currents or cold currents. And so your cyclone needs to be over warm water to stay at the same intensity. So if it tracks over a cold current, it might weaken slightly. If it tracks over a warm current, it might intensify a little bit. Also, the currents, can steer the cyclone in a certain direction, but they're also going to be steered by other things like if there's a big ridge in the atmosphere that might stall the cyclone, or especially if you've got two big things in the atmosphere that balance each other and then the cyclone gets stuck. And that happened in Queensland last year when we had, now I'm going to forget its name, the big cyclone that hit Brisbane.
Oh, no,
I can't believe I can't remember its name. But anyway, it stalled for a long time as it was approaching, which is partly why there were such insanely huge wave heights on the Gold Coast. If you saw like the pictures online of the beach erosion, it was just incredible. But there were wave boys were recording, 12-meter high waves. And that when you get those really nasty waves, it's when you have a really slow moving storm and a big storm and a strong storm. But when you have wind blowing on water, it needs enough time to build the biggest waves that you can get from that wind. And when there's enough time and enough ocean for the wind to blow on, then you get what's called fully developed seas. So it's the worst possible waves for the wind. And that's what happens. So if you have a slow-moving, big, and strong cyclone, that's your worst case scenario for sea state.
Right.
Yeah. So it's different. When people think about cyclone damage on land, you really only need to know the wind speed or how much it's going to rain. But when you're talking about things in the ocean, you need to know how big is the cyclone. So if you've got typhoon tip, whoa, watch out. But okay, so the perfect example of this is Cyclone Larry, which you might remember from 2006 when the price of bananas went sky high because Cyclone Larry hit land up in Queensland and flattened all the bananas plants. So Larry, though, at the time was the strongest cyclone to ever cross into the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, but it was super fast moving and super tight, super small. And so it didn't do that much damage to reefs because it rocketed past them. So they got extreme conditions for like 20 minutes and that was it.
Right. So the sea state didn't change as much.
It couldn't. It didn't have time. And it was small, so it didn't have as much fetch, not enough distance for the wind to blow over to build it up. And so in contrast, you might have heard, I know we're in WA, but you might have heard of Cyclone Debbie, which caused a lot of damage in the Whitsundays in 2017. And spare a thought for the poor people on Hamilton Island. Normally, when you have to shelter from a cyclone, it's for a few hours. And they were like sheltering for more than a day because it was so slow moving. And it was category 4, not quite as strong as Larry, but a normal size, not a tiny size. And so it generated way more damage for the islands and the reefs that it went near because of that different set of characteristics.
What is happening to the reefs when a cyclone comes? So obviously it's the big swells, a lot of power and waves and water.
Yep. So there's 3 main possible things that can happen. The big waves, as you said, which is what I usually focus on. Also, as we saw with Cyclone Jasper, which came through the Great Barrier Reef recently, it wasn't very strong, but it dropped a bucket load of rain. And so when you get a lot of rain really fast, you can get what are called flood plumes of fresh water coming out of the river mouths, and they're usually laden with sediment and whatever has run off the land. And reefs, you may or may not know, use sunlight. They have tiny plants living inside the
zooxanthellae.
Zooxanthellae, yep. Tiny little plants living inside the little corals, and they do photosynthesis and they make sugar out of the sun. So if you put a big nasty flood plume on top of them, they're not getting sun, and you're changing the salinity of the water, and a whole bunch of sediment and other things might drop on them and smother them. So for your inshore reefs that are used to those kind of conditions, they have mechanisms where they've adapted to like clear sediment off themselves, and they're used to making the most of the light they get and stuff. Sorry, ecologists, I've said that in a very blasé way.
If anyone wants more information, I did a podcast with Shannon D about turbid reefs. So
fantastic.
Yep, there can be more information in that spot.
Shannon can tell you all the ways. I've just bastardized that. But anyway, if you're talking about your mid-shelf and your outer shelf reefs, they're not used to that. So that's another damage. And then a much more rare one is where you have water deep enough that the whole water column doesn't get mixed, but instead there's a bit of water that's too deep to get mixed and it's cold and full of nutrients. Wave action in a cyclone might reach all the way down to there and upwell that cold, nutrient-rich water to the surface, and that can cause like a phytoplankton bloom, which can be harmful, but it ties into a later question you're going to ask, because that upwelling of cold water can actually be helpful.
Let's jump straight into that question because I was going to ask that right now.
Yeah. So I'm sure on everyone's mind who knows anything about coral reefs has heard about coral bleaching, because we're in the middle of a global bleaching event. And in Australia, for I think the first time ever, we had bleaching this past summer that went all the way around Australia, all the way from like Rottnest Island all the way up the north and down the other side, down to the southern Great Barrier Reef. I was on a field trip off Onslow in March, and virtually every single coral we saw was either dead, bleached, or partially bleached.
I've just been working up there, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Over the last few years.
Yeah, so if corals are bleaching, the reason they're bleaching is because the water has been too hot for too long. So if the water is more than 1 degree Celsius hotter than what is the long-term conditions that they usually get, and that lasts for at least 4 weeks in a row, then what happens is those little zooxanthellae, those plants that feed the corals, their photosynthesis chemical reactions get too much heat powering them, and toxins begin to be produced, and the corals are forced to eject them. Well, to the kids, I say, they spit them out. And it's the photosynthetic pigments in the zooxanthellae that give the corals their color. And so once they eject the zooxanthellae, they look white. So that's why we call it bleaching. But what it essentially means is that the corals are starving because they get 95% of their energy from their plant friends. Now, tying back to your question, I know I'm very long-winded. If this cool water from deep below gets upwelled at a time when corals are tending towards enough thermal stress to bleach, or they're already bleaching, then you can get beneficial cooling.
So there's positive impacts from cyclones.
Yes, and ironically, the scope for those positive impacts is increasing as the severity and the frequency of bleaching is increasing. Cyclone frequency is staying the same. So a few years ago, a PhD student of mine and I used satellite sea surface temperature data to reconstruct the cooling zones or the cool wakes of every cyclone in the world tropics from 1985 to 2009. And we're in the process of updating those. And we looked at how often and what's the probability of the cyclone being in the right place at the right time with the bleaching events. But back then, we didn't have nearly as many bleaching events as we have now. So, yeah.
Is there a correlation between, like, because bleaching comes a lot usually from the warmer waters? Does that increase
bleaching
the chances?
Bleaching tends to happen in summer, and cyclones tend to happen, when the water. But the fact that the corals are bleaching is irrelevant. But the fact that the water's hot enough, it just means cyclones. One of the 6 factors that leads to cyclone formation is there, but the other 5 need to happen as well.
Okay.
Which is people often forget that, and they think, oh, we're going to get more cyclones because the water's too hot.
Yeah. Well, so what about climate change? Does that mean we might get a higher frequency in cyclones?
Yeah. So people often think that, and it's quicker to write it that way in a journal paper when you have like half a sentence that you can devote to it. But what it means is when a cyclone has already spun up and the SST or the temperature of the skin temperature of the ocean is that hot, it is more conducive for it to intensify rapidly. But there's the 5 other factors besides the sea surface temperature that need to happen for a cyclone to actually spin up. And some of them actually are decreasing with climate change. And the most notable one of that is wind shear. So it varies spatially, though, across the globe. But there are areas of the globe where there's going to be more wind shear, which means less cyclones because they'll get shredded by the wind shear. So it's not as simple as just using your common sense, because it's actually those 6 things, not that one thing. It's not just how hot the water is. It's gradients in the atmosphere between the middle, lower, and upper atmosphere are important. A meteorologist could tell you that better, but the main thing to remember is just that, there's 6 things that affect it. They all have to coincide. It's not as easy as you think to spin up the cyclone.
Are cyclones important? Like, do they play a role of importance if you lose cyclones? Say climate change did increase the wind shear and stop cyclones from happening. Is that?
I don't think I don't think they'll ever stop, because what they essentially are, if you think on a global systems scale, they're essentially a heat transfer mechanism from the equator to the poles. So they form over the hot water when the conditions are right, and you never see a cyclone tracking from the southern hemisphere into the northern hemisphere. They always track poleward. So if you get a cyclone forming near the equator in the southern hemisphere, it's going to track southward. Like, it's not going to make it to the South Pole, but it's going in that general direction. Might spin around a bit and do some meanders and loops, just especially in Queensland, which is like the most chaotic cyclone tracks in the world. But yeah, so we're always going to have more heat in the tropics than we are at the poles, even if that gradient gets less as we heat the planet. So I can't imagine that they're going to disappear. However, the other side to your question is, do they matter ecologically? And to that, I would say cyclones, if they're staying about the same, which is what's mainly predicted in terms of frequency, or if they decline slightly, it's still important to understand what they're doing and reconstruct past histories and future time series of what they might do, because they interact with the other threats that affect reefs. And there's synergies between the different stressors or disturbances that can affect reefs or mangroves or seagrasses or whatever. And so there's a tendency of people to think, oh, I'm not going to waste my time researching that because the real player is coral bleaching or over a long time scale, the ocean acidification. But if you have a time series of corals and what their coral cover has been and what, life history traits, which ones have been the dominant ones, and you have that over, 30 years or something, and you want to try and figure out, how did corals respond? Why did coral cover go up in this year and down in this year? And why don't we have many branching corals here and many, massive corals there? It's going to be reacting to everything that was happening. So the cyclone information fits into that. And that's a big part of what I do, is try and reconstruct histories so that people, when they're looking at that data, can figure out, did the cyclone do it? Because you'd be surprised at how many studies are published where the way they answer that question is, and no offense to anyone, we all are short on time, but is they say, ooh, I see a big drop of coral cover and I see that there was a hurricane, because it's usually in the North Atlantic, and therefore the cyclone did it. Or they draw like a buffer zone, so a distance zone, and say, oh, it's within 100 kilometers of this cyclone track, and it was category this, therefore the cyclone did it. But remember, I was just telling you that it's actually really straightforward to reconstruct exactly what the winds were and where, and therefore then also the waves. So you don't need to guess. And there's a lot of spatial structure in that. It doesn't conform to those buffer zones. If you remember me talk about Cyclone Lua, it got damaged. Damage occurred 800 and some kilometers away, which wouldn't be captured by your, the cyclone was nearby, because that's not nearby.
No. Do the cyclones like wipe out coral reefs? Or are the reefs sort of robust enough to withstand?
Yeah, so, okay, there's two dimensions to that question. So cyclones and reefs have co-evolved, if you can put it that way, over millennia, and they can recover over time. How long it takes depend on the severity of the damage. It could be 5 years or it could be centuries. Where you would get centuries would be if the waves are such that they fundamentally change the hydrodynamics of the reefs. Maybe you never recover back to what you were. Or like really fast recovery, could be just you lose a few colonies, but there's plenty remaining to reseed the reef. So corals can recover, but it's always true as well, which is the other part, the dimension to what you've asked, is that the damage is super patchy. So you might remember at the beginning I said cyclones are like a dream for a geographer, because it seems like it's so easy to reconstruct the spatial relationships. But when you look closer, it's super hard, because reefs block each other from waves, creating that wave shadow. But also the parts of a reef, all the separate colonies vary in their structural vulnerability to being damaged by waves. So if they're a branching coral, they're much easier to break than a massive coral, which is like a round ball. It's more hydrodynamic. It depends how big they are. If they're really little, then the waves can't really do anything. If they're really huge bommies, like some of the ones that have been found in WA, then they're also pretty resistant. But if they're in that mid-term range, famous paper by Terry Doan that showed this years ago, that's when they're the most vulnerable. And then there's a heap of other factors as well. And usually we have no data on any of these things. So it becomes really hard. So let's say a cyclone's just passed through and, you know, we don't know what the percentage of sizes you find on a particular part of a reef is at the moment. Like, 'cause imagine surveying all of the world's reefs, or even the whole GBR, or even one reef like Scott Reef, and tracking every single colony all the time. Like, and it also depends on things like, did it get eaten by crown thorns recently? Have like fish that munch on coral been biting it and weakening its skeleton? Does it have a strong attachment to the actual reef? What's the reef substrate itself like? Is it loose and unconsolidated, rubbly stuff? Or is it a stronger thing for it to be attached to? So all those things affect where the damage actually happens at those fine scales.
Right. I'm assuming that would also affect the recovery of these systems as well.
Yeah. So
is there a rough, you can give like a rough timeline of like the recovery on a coral reef after a cyclone?
Yeah. So it can range from as little as 5 years all the way up to centuries. So, but the fact that it's so patchy is helpful for recovery because you have corals left behind that may be of a size that they can reproduce to eventually replace the corals that may have died. And then you also can have fragments. So if you have branchy corals that break off and the pieces of them don't die, they can reattach and regrow.
How do cyclones affect the migratory animals? So you got lots of migratory birds, which I'm assuming would be the most affected, but then you've got whales as well. Is there... it's a very broad question. We'll start with the birds.
No,
how does it affect?
Don't forget turtles.
Turtles, yes.
Yeah. So with migratory birds, they can be delayed by the wind, but the wind...
they won't try to fly through it.
Well, the wind can also help them.
Right.
If they are able to use it as a tailwind. I haven't really looked into birds, but Michelle Tums at Ames, my colleague, and I worked on a paper, which we haven't published, which she had tracking data for a bunch of turtles. And this one turtle during Cyclone Rusty, I forget exactly what year that was in WA, the turtle actually veered way off its course because of Cyclone Rusty. So we could plot its path.
Is it followed the cyclone course, or it was like, I'm out of here?
When you look at its whole track, you could see where it was going and where it ended up. And when I downloaded modeled data of wave heights, when the wave heights started to get nasty, you could see the turtle like did this big veer off to the side, and then when it dissipated, it came back to the general track it was taking.
Oh, right. Wow.
Because when they're swimming, if you're talking about 4 meters significant wave height, that's like an individual wave height could be up to 10 meters high, and you think of how big a turtle is. There's also an interesting potential for metabolic cost to the turtle, not just from having to swim in the waves, but if the cold water comes up, they get cold.
Yeah.
So whales, I haven't looked into how cyclones affect them. I mean, they're a lot bigger, so presumably it would take more wave power to buffet them.
We see all images of the ocean generally at pretty calm weather because that's when they can fly drones and get cameras and all that. But obviously the seas can be incredibly rough. And the animals that are out there, I've always wondered, what happens to the birds? What are they, like whales and our turtles? And
so what we've talked about so far is like them directly responding to the wave action, but there's also the fact that they may be relying on things that get damaged by the waves. So turtle nesting beaches can get flooded or eroded or whatever. Seagrass beds that they might feed on could be destroyed. So there's all that side to it as well. And then when you think of coral reefs, obviously they're habitat for lots of fish. And there's been interesting studies. I think it was just a report, never a journal article, but there was one study that looked at in Queensland how fish were responding to the cooling and changing their depth in response to the cooler water in the aftermath of a cyclone. But it's also well known that fish obviously respond when all the structure of the reef that they depend on isn't there if it gets flattened. And especially it's hard on the demersal fish, which have the very specific locations where they live and they can't just easily range to somewhere else like the fish that are more wide-ranging do.
How do you model cyclones? What are you putting into the data and...
Yeah, so my aim when I'm trying to model cyclones is very specific. I'm trying to reconstruct a spatial area beyond which you would not expect to find any catastrophic, really bad damage to coral reefs. And inside that zone where you say, okay, this is where the nasty damage could be, you accept that it's going to be patchy in there because usually, I'd say 99.9% of the time, we don't have the data to resolve that patchiness because it's all those things I was talking about. And so I do that because it gives you a starting point of, a footprint of where the cyclone could be the culprit if you see damage. It gives you a place to start. And when you look at it in those terms, field data that we have for several cyclones now, like 10 of them on the Great Barrier Reef, shows that works pretty well. So I feed that into the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority's Tropical Cyclone Response Plan. If there's a cyclone that looks like it has a chance to be destructive to the Great Barrier Reef based on where it's tracking and what its characteristics are, then I run that model and then we calculate, how big of an impact do we think it could be? And then if it's warranted, they might go out and do a field survey so that we can test how well it worked. And it can just guide how they want to respond. So, for example, after Cyclone Debbie, they ended up going out in the field and, moving around some of the live fragments of branching corals that were still there. So they had a better chance. Yeah. So, but they're not going to do that every time. They're going to, because that's a lot of money. So they're going to wait for when that's most needed and most likely to be a positive impact. So yeah, my work is to try and reconstruct these spatial footprints of the cyclones, which then I collaborate with ecologists and sometimes geomorphologists, where there's actual data about reefs and how they've changed over time, so that can give them an insight into the cyclone part of that story.
Does it help with future predictions?
So with future predictions, the time series for which we have cyclone recorded data where you can do the kind of thing I just described is like way too short to try and predict into the future. And obviously the climate's changing. So with that, what you can do is there are cyclone climatologists who run global climate models under various scenarios. And in those, if they're of high enough resolution spatially, you can detect the cyclones. And so what you end up with are sets of what are called synthetic cyclone tracks. So they're potential tracks a cyclone could make under this model scenario. It doesn't mean that that's exactly what's going to happen or that that's going to happen next year at this place. Usually those kinds of models in terms of where the cyclones are and how many are really good at ocean basin scales. So it's tricky to use them. You can take them then and run the same modeling on them that I described that I do. You can reconstruct the wind field every hour and then approximate the wave field or run a numerical wave model to do it in a more sophisticated way. But you need to be aware, which we looked at this in a 2022 study, that we're not sure that that's where they're going to go. Like, we're really not sure. And so if you just take that data and just believe it, like, without keeping that in mind, you think, oh, well, I'm not going to do this reef restoration project right here because a cyclone's going to hit there. That's not what the data really tells you. It's useful over a long term, like, it's like probabilities, like a 1 in 100 year flood. It tells you in a 100-year period, this is the chance of a flood, but it could happen in any one of those years. It doesn't tell you in 3 years when I'm going to deploy these heat-resistant corals, a cyclone's going to hit here. So it's tricky.
Is there like a such thing as like a cyclone prevention, or like you can get prepared, but is there
There's no way to prevent a cyclone.
No, yeah, so prevent the destruction on a reef, or as much like restrict it, or it's a bit of it's a bit of a weird question, but
it's not a weird question at all. I'm sure the first thing people always say to me, like kids or adults, when I talk to them about bad things happening to reefs, they want to know what they can do. So, I mean, with coral bleaching, the number one thing you can do is lower your carbon footprint and make sure less carbon dioxide's going into the air. But for cyclones, they're going to happen or they're not going to happen. I guess the more you remove things that harm reefs that we can remove, like anchor damage, pollution, poor water quality, etc., then that increases their natural ability to recover. So don't overfish the reef, and then if it gets damaged by a cyclone, it'll be more able to recover. But there's nothing that you can do. It's not like with crown of thorn starfish where you can go out and like kill them. So
but if a healthier reef would be more resilient.
A healthier reef will be more resilient. Yep.
If you had unlimited time and money, what's your dream project?
Oh, so I would probably try and merge all the different things that I work on. So at the beginning, we talked about my outreach program. And so I think I would try and devise something where as many people could feed into it, yet it could still be scientifically useful. And we've got a lot of great examples of that, like with citizen science. There's an amazing lady called, now I'm going to forget her name.
The mental blank, yeah.
She's wrote a great book called The Arbonaut. And so she was one of the first people to study the canopy of trees, and Meg Lohman. And so she used to go caving, and she used her skills from caving to actually climb up into the canopies of trees. And then she decided to create all these tree canopy walkways all over the world where there's a lot of tropical rainforest and not tropical trees. And it spurs these things like bioblitzes where citizen science can go and so they did record what the biodiversity is, and that can underpin getting that area protected. So she did a bioblitz in Penang Hill in Malaysia, and that led to it being protected. And then she was able to before that, she built the canopy walkway. And then I contacted her when I read her book, And I said, oh, I've got this giant banner of tree drawings. And she's like, okay, bring it there. And you can film it on the rainforest walkway, which is like 12 meters above the rainforest. So we've got this great video of the giant banner of drawings. So yeah, I think I'd like to get people excited about science and what it can teach us, but not just hearing about it, but getting to be part of it, but also having it be robust so it leads to actual outcomes that they can see. So these walkways lead to actual outcomes in these third world countries where people get jobs, you know, as part of the whole thing. So it's actually materially improving the lives of people as well as knowledge, which is, in my view, is what science is for.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic.
That's a very broad answer.
Yeah, I think it seems almost feasible though. Like if you keep pushing towards that, it might be small, but it keeps working that direction and gets bigger and bigger, right?
Well, I like to think like I've learned to like counter my perfectionism that I was born with, and any little thing that moves us forward, to notice it, celebrate it, and realize it has worth. And then, like you said, when you join with other people with similar viewpoints and people come together and feel what it feels like to be part of something, it kind of snowballs with positivity.
And on that note, I'm going to say thank you so much for joining in this, as this is a way of getting information and education out there as well. So thank you so much for joining me on today's podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for doing this. Good on you.